So, before we start, let me just remind you to hit that subscribe button if you don't want to miss any of my other videos, and to hit like if you like this, or by all means, hit the thumbs down if you don't. Also, please check out my Facebook group where you can ask questions, discuss the videos, and where I post most of my updates. You can also find all my other videos about folklore under the playlist Scandinavian folklore here on my channel. Except for this, I want to highlight my Patreon page if you want to support me and my annoyed cat Skorpan. Or if you just want to buy me a coffee, you can go on coffee.com. All the links are in the description below. So, with that out of the way, let's start talking about the invisible people, because that's what you are here for, I hope. One of the beings that lives close to humans in Scandinavian folklore is the invisibles. These are not one and the same being. This is a sort of a catch-all name that includes very many of different beings that we have up here. Sometimes it is hard to decide if it is several different beings or one and the same being. You will get different answers depending on who you ask and where in Scandinavia you ask. Higher up in the north of Sweden they are called vittra. And if you visit Gotland, the big island in the Baltic Sea, they are named de små underjordi, which means the small ones underground. And in Norway, they are generally called huldrefolk, and Iceland also used the word huldrefolkir. Further south in Sweden, you can find them under the name vättar or Älvor. All of these beings are so similar that you can put them under the collective word, the invisibles. But at the same time, they are completely different beings. As usual with the folklore, it is stories that spread, changed, and end up getting their own life, and trying to put these beings in neat lists and boxes is not easily done. Therefore, I found it easier to make a video about the invisibles and include both vättar, vittra, Älvor, huldrefolkir, and huldrefolk, although they are in some areas completely separate beings. Just like tomten, trolls, and our mistress of lakes and mountains and forests, all of these invisible beings seem to have their root in the pre-Christian era. Snorre Sturlason in the Edda writes about dökkalfar, dark elves, and ljósalfar, light elves. This can in some ways be interpreted as evil and good, but as we already established in many of my other videos, it is not that simple. The Iron Age religions seem to have had more sides than just black or white. This might instead be more about chaos and order. It is also mentioned in the old Icelandic tales about the practice of putting out food and gifts for them to keep the neighborliness between humans and the invisibles. And this seems to be a very old-rooted habit, something that the people didn't stop doing just because we became Christians. And you that have seen my previous videos about folklore knows what comes now. Yes, of course, this was not looked upon with keen eyes from the church. The church have never liked any kind of folklore because that is a version of idolatry. And the Christian medieval church, with its very black and white view of the world, deemed the invisibles as the devil's henchmen. But the people kept on telling stories about these beings and also kept doing offerings to them all the way up until today. It is not as common and as traditionalized as putting porridge out for your tomte, but at least up until about 100 years ago, people still left some food or booze on the pile of rocks where they knew the invisibles lived. And for sure, they warned the invisibles before pouring out something hot on the ground. "Look out down below," my grandma used to call before pouring out her hot washing water when we was visiting their fishing cottage during summers. If my grandma really believed in them, I don't know, I don't think she did. But she went by the tradition and the feeling of, what harm can it do? Better safe than sorry. According to the Edda, these beings, the Alfar, was part of the godly beings, just like dwarves, the gods, and Jotnar. All these beings went under the name of Vettir. Somewhere during history, after we get Christianized up here, the story about where the invisible people came from changed and got a more Christianized version, both in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. The story has many different versions, where the details is a bit different. But the core of the story goes that Adam and Eve got so many children that Eve was ashamed of how many they had, and she hid them from God and denied their existence. God then got angry and said, "What man hides from God, God will hide from man." The children then turned invisible, and all the invisible people comes from these children, just like all humans come from the children Adam and Eve didn't try to hide. The invisible people lives next to humans, or, well, rather under them. They live under our floors, in the big oak tree in the yard, or under rocks and hills where the animal grazed, and they share a lot of traits with the trolls, and also at the same time with our tomte. Just as with the trolls and some of the other folklore beings, the further away from the farm they lived, the more dangerous they were. I have included Älvor, the Nordic elves, under the invisibles, just like the Institute for Language and Folk Memories does on their online map for the collective of the stories around folklore. And even if they do share some similarities with the other invisibles, they are at the same time very different. While in Iceland and Norway the terms huldrefolk and huldrefolkir seems to in general be more similar to what we in Sweden call vättar or vittra, Älvor stands out. They might have had more similarities with both huldrefolk, vättar and vittra from the start, but later in history they are clearly treated in the stories as a being of their own. It is a clear fact that Tolkien took a lot of inspiration from the Nordic mythology and folklore when he created the books around the Lord of the Ring. But his noble and statuesque elves are far from the Swedish elves in the folklore. The Swedish elves are white or light grey fog creatures that you normally don't see at all. You just hear them and their music. In the stories that do describe people that has been lucky or unlucky enough to see them, the elves are described as beautiful women, small as dolls and very white, almost so they glow by themselves. They are very often dancing in the fog, and when you see the low-hanging fog over a meadow, it is easy to see how these stories came about. If you look hard enough, you can almost see them yourself, dancing little creatures in the white moving fog. Älvor danced in the mornings and evenings, and you could see where because they left circles of darker grass on the meadows after their dancing. Not much is told about these beings more than that they seem to be living in groups and that they very seldom did any good for the humans. Only a few stories tells of someone warning them from getting burned on the fire or something like that, and thus get rewarded. But mostly these beings have stories that tells of people getting sick or crazy. Swedish elves are not generally a nice being. It is very often told that if you pee in one of those rings that the Älvor left behind after their dancing, you would get sick and lose your ability to, get it up if you were a man. Hearing their music could mean it was already too late. You would never ever get that music out of your ears again, and you will probably be crazy for the rest of your life. If you was foolish enough to enter the dance, then they could either dance with you until you dropped dead from exhaustion, or they took you in under the mountain and forced you to live with them there in their grey, strange, misty lands they had there. Sometimes they just kept you for a while and then let you go, but you would never be the same again. If the Älvor had put sickness on you, there was one way to try and be saved. Find one of the small pits called älvakvarnar, elven mills, and put some fat or booze or coins there to try and please them to take the sickness away again. Today we know that dark green circles on the grass is made from a special type of fungus that grows in a circle pattern and make the grass change color due to the chemical change on the soil. And the little elven mills are holes left by the Bronze Age people that made carvings into the rocks. We do not know, however, what those little holes actually were for. Could they have served a religious purpose, or did they just came to be because there our ancestors grounded and mixed the paint for the other carvings? That is something neither me nor anyone else can actually answer, and for the people back in the days that didn't know so much about archaeology in Bronze Age, this was deemed to be magical and made by the elves. Just as with trolls and other folklore beings, the Nordic elves have been used to explain different mental issues and also some sexual transmitted diseases. And these elven meals was sometimes the only hope of getting rid of whatever plagued you. I guess that a theory that isn't too far out there is that the elves from the beginning was Älvor, dark elves, and the rest of the invisibles that goes under the name huldrefolk, vättar and vittra was the use Älvor. Huldrefolk, vättar, vittra, they are much more similar to each other, even if they also have their own special sets of traits. And they are not as chaotic and evil as the elves. They all live in families like the trolls do, and just like the trolls, they have livestock, they wash their clothes, have babies and marry, they do baking, and seem to live normal lives like we have. But like the tomte, they live closer to us than the Älvor tend to do. They are our invisible neighbors, and as long as you respect them, they don't usually cause so much trouble. They tend to look like we do, they might be a bit smaller, and if they are wearing red clothes, you need to watch out, because that could be a warning of dangers in the near future. Or that they were angry over something, which often is kind of the same thing. You do not want to anger your invisible magical neighbors, because that's when things can go very wrong and your barn burns down or your kids get sick. There is a story told from many places around Sweden about the vätte or the vittra, and that is the one about where one of the invisibles pay a visit to a farmer one night and complains that the new barn is in the wrong place. The cows are pissing right down on the dinner table for the poor family of the vätte. The farmer follows the man down below and is invited in a very rich and beautiful home under the barn floor. But just as the vätte told him, he can see that from the roof of the dinner table the cow's piss is dripping down. The farmer moves the cows and the barn, and the vätte family is rewarding him in some way, usually with a silver spoon or a sheep or a cow that is so big and fat and beautiful and milks so much better than the other animals they have. This story is told in a vast variety. Sometimes they only understand what is happening because the cows or the horse is so thin and always stands completely soaked from sweat every morning. But when they move the barn, the cow or the horse is suddenly fine again. Sometimes it is the farmer's wife that has the sight and say good morning to her neighbor that she sees in the corner of her eyes. And then the invisible sneer that it would be a good morning if the cows or the horses didn't piss on the table. There are other stories about what can happen when you accidentally build your barn over the invisible's roads or houses. Sometimes the cows are miserable and restless, and when a smart woman or man does some magic, they can see that the invisibles have their main road down to the lake right through the barn. They move the barn, and after that everything calms down and the animal thrives again. Vättar was also used to explain some strange things found in nature. Before we all got enlightened by education, or did we really? People thought that when they found fossil parts of the extinct squid-like creature, the belemnite, this was candles that the vättar had left for some reason. They called these stones vätteljus, vätte candles, and they was of course considered very magical, and they could cure all kinds of illness. When it is not stories that comes directly from the farm, it comes from what is called fäbodarna. Fä is a word for animal and bod is a word for a small cottage, so basically animal cottage. There is a lot of land that is not suitable for growing crops, but it still has a lot of good rich grass that grows there. In some areas, these lands was high up in the mountains, and in some areas further in the south, it could be close to bogs and marshlands. Before we had tractors and large machines to help us with farming, the grass that grew closest to the farm was needed for the winter and could not be used for food for the animals during the summer. So the young girls and women, and sometimes very young boys, took the cows and the sheep to these places during summer to get good food for the animals, while the grass that grew closer to the farm could be turned into hay for the colder month. It was a hard life for a couple of weeks for the herders. The days was filled with work, with milking, making butter and cheese, picking berries, and taking care of all the wool that came from the sheep. Some of them also collected birch bark that was used later to make a lot of different crafts. The life up in the fäbodarna could sometimes also be very lonely, and it was far between the cottages. The milkmaids developed a very special song technique called kulning. It is used both as a calling for the cows and the goats and to get in contact with the other cottages in the area, because the voice with this calling technique is carrying very well over a long distance. I have tested myself, and it goes at least 3 kilometers in the right wooded areas. Different sounds meant different things, so the women, girls and boys could make sure if their long-distance neighbor was either safe or needed help with something like an animal that had gotten lost. The herders also used horns made out of birch bark. Both kulning and the birch bark horns still lives on in our Scandinavian folk music, and it is a very special sound. Up in these lonely places, of course, there was a good place to put stories about vättar or vittra. There's a lot of stories, one that shows up in several places and sometimes even told about trolls instead of vättar. And that is about the young woman that is up alone in one of these summer cottages, and the vättar wants her to marry one of them. In several other versions, she managed to get the dog to run down to the farm and get help. When her fiancé or brother is arriving at the cottage, she is already dressed as a bride, and he managed to save her with just minutes from getting taken by the invisibles. Sometimes these stories also tells that the crown the bride had been given was given to the church to be used for other brides. That is a tradition since long in Sweden, that the local church have at least one bridal crown that the bride is allowed to borrow for her big day. A tradition that still goes on today, and some of the crowns that the brides can borrow has 150 years or more as a track record. They are very beautiful, and the older ones is not hard to imagine having a sort of magical origin from the invisibles. They almost look a bit otherworldly in their beautiful craftsmanship. Just like the tradition around the bridal crowns, the stories and beliefs in the invisibles have lived on into our modern days. But today it is not told about barns and cows that needed to be moved. Hey, katten! But today it is not told about barns and cows that needs to be moved. It is told about big roads that is built on top of vättar or vittra homes, and therefore that part of the road has a spiking high amount of car accidents or other strange things that happens there. The vättar is angry and is causing trouble. One of these roads is here, a big freeway called E4, just north of the town of Gävle. In Iceland this also happens at some places, and I haven't any fact on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was also the case in Norway. I know for a fact that in both Sweden and Iceland there are stories, lots of them, and I don't think Norway is much different here. The stories about road trucks breaking down, car accidents, people dying under very strange circumstances, and so on. And if you see a strange curve on a road where the logical place would be to put it straight, you can bet your sweet behind on that there will be stories about how the government was forced to move just this part of the road around the vättar home. If the stories are true or not is a case of belief. If you ask the government, they will deny it and say it is for a different reason. But the people believing will say that the government denies it because they can't be seen as people believing in the invisibles. So, what do you believe? Could it be the invisibles? Or perhaps ghosts? With those thoughts, I will leave you for this time. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and I'll see you in my next video. Subscribe!